Hello and welcome to The Key, where we discuss your vehicle program and how to optimize it for efficiency on the road. My name is Lee Adam and I'm a vehicle program expert here at CarData. Today I'm joined by Griffin Dumaresque-Henshaw, who is an expert on the pre-sales side here at CarData. She works with prospective clients in understanding their needs and figuring out what program is right for them. Hey Griffin, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you doing, Lee?
I am great. So today we're going to be talking about fleet. The scary question in the room, company cars. Often they're associated with a lot of risk, a lot of cost, and a lot of burden. Organizations today, more than ever before, are asking themselves whether fleet is right for them. What are the options if we're going to avoid or replace company cars? Now, we have Griffin here today, so I want to start, Griffin, by really asking you from your perspective, in understanding how customers are coming to us before making the transition. Why is fleet becoming so obsolete? Why are people making the switch away?
100%. So definitely the landscape of work over the last several years has changed quite a bit, and accordingly people are looking to address their car programs and see what's really working for them and why they're using the programs they're using. So with that natural kind of education piece, people are realizing that fleet might not be the best way forward for them as they transition to a kind of a new world of work.
It's modernizing out there. There's different approaches coming to light, particularly in the tax-free front. And I think companies are experiencing like a lot of burden in management, in cost, in liability, which is ultimately impacting them, of course.
100%. Yeah, definitely the administrative burden of a fleet program is very significant, as are the costs of running it. And especially with things like acquiring vehicles, that has become increasingly difficult over the last period of time. Definitely time to reassess and see what's going to be the best next step for these sorts of companies.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's a perfect segue. So when considering what that next step is, when taking a deep breath and thinking, okay, what do I do with my company cars? How do I make the switch? What does a successful vehicle program really look like for these organizations?
For sure, for sure. So a successful vehicle program can really look different, depends on the needs of the organization. So for some, that's a large cost reduction is their main area of focus. For others, they want equitable compensation. Perhaps they have people driving significantly different amounts. So kind of working with a partner, a vehicle partner, you can figure out what are your priorities and needs and how are you going to effectively address both company needs as well as employee needs to find a solution that works for everyone. So
true, so true. I could at least say that I've never seen a company car to fixed and variable rate or reimbursement in general transition work the same twice, right? Everybody has different goals, whether it be cost reduction, risk reduction. So I think it's really important, as you mentioned, to understand what those goals look like so we can build effectively towards it.
For sure, yeah. We were actually recently on a call with a large beverage company and they were discussing how they're seeing across their industry a lot of beverage companies moving away from fleet programs. And they were talking about how they're going to implement it. Obviously, there's a large change management piece talking about potentially grandfathering things in, especially as they go through large merger and acquisitions to potentially bring people in on a new program, as opposed to having to deal with that onboarding cost and difficulty when it comes to fleet.
So true. So let's talk about the costs and the difficulties associated with fleet. So tell me a little bit about the costs associated with owning and operating a fleet program, and why is it a problem?
For sure, for sure. So many companies don't even understand the different things going into the cost of their fleet program. It's hard to get a comprehensive understanding. There's a lot of different pieces at play. There's vehicle maintenance, there's the cost of fuel, there's the cost of onboarding and offboarding new employees. And all that really adds up. And quite frankly, at the end of the day, a lot of companies don't actually know what they're paying for. They know the end result, the vehicle they're getting on the road, but they don't understand all these different fees that are associated with it and why that cost is so high.
Definitely, and it makes it so hard for them to benchmark and actually forecast for the year, right? Because they might have no idea what costs they're going to incur because they're allowing themselves to be exposed to all this cost risk because of the way that their program is set up.
100%. And when you do look at something like a merger or acquisition project with a lot of the companies we're working with that can be such a huge pain point in addressing, bringing on a whole new sales team. How are they going to get them in vehicles? Is that realistic?
Totally. And now that you mention it, right, we think we understand the costs associated with transitions. You mentioned maintenance fees and all of these other elements, but there's also fuel spend, insurance costs, registration fees, taxes, violation expenses, accident costs. I could go on. The list is long, right? But often people don't understand them and they can't guess for the year what that cost is going to look like. So with that being said, how does a vehicle reimbursement program focused on personal vehicles differ from the ability to forecast and to estimate what costs are going to look like for the next year?
100%. So I would speak to the main difference is the fact that in a vehicle reimbursement program, you simply understand where the cost is coming from. You understand the breakdown, why certain costs are what they are, and how they're going to change over time. It's also something you have a lot more of a stake in and you can speak to. So if you want your cost to go down, you can work with your vehicle reimbursement program to make that happen, whereas in a fleet that might not be realistic. So definitely just the understanding piece, it's a lot more clear in terms of what you're paying for and why these costs are associated with your program.
So true. If you understand, the base in what model you're using to build your fixed and variable rates, for example, if it's based off a Toyota Corolla, it's based off a blended sedan, whatever you choose, you understand those costs and you can forecast effectively because you know, based on historical mileage data, inflation, etc., what your costs are going to be. There's no exposure to anything else, which is really great. Now, I think we actually talked to a customer recently who their costs associated with, I think it was like a 50 vehicle fleet program, was almost $1 million, around $750,000, right? It's a lot of money. And for them, the problem was just, hey, we didn't expect to have this cost. It's not sold that way, of course, whether you're working with like a fleet management partner or an internal fleet manager, they just don't expect it, right? Often there's an accident or there's a major turnover or a car depreciates and you have to buy a new one at the new market cost. So it tends to really suck out the ability to be flexible and to scale, which is an interesting topic to discuss, of course.
100%, definitely. There's a lot more room for scalability within a vehicle reimbursement program versus a fleet program. You can uptake it a lot quicker.
Now let's talk a little bit about the other costs associated with fleet, particularly personal use chargebacks. Walk me through a little bit about the pain associated both to the organization and to drivers when they're seeing those charges.
For sure, for sure. So with fleet, we're assuming that the driver is driving 100% of their time for business reasons, which is definitely not the case. In order to account for this, we look at business use percentages. So we have to have individuals recording their personal mileage and personal driving so that the tax is taken into account versus their business driving. So that's definitely something that's a large burden both on employees and employers. Employers may worry if it's being accurately recorded, and for employees it's a burden, on their weekends to have to be paying attention to these things.
Totally. It's such a burden, and often companies are just estimating, more like guesstimating, what they think that their employees' personal use is, and they'll slap a flat percentage on it, and then their employees will feel the burden, the financial burden of that percentage, but without necessarily seeing any benefit to it. So I think that's definitely a good perspective. And now if we look at favor, so fixed and variable reimbursement, from the angle of business use percentage, how does the fleet's approach of giving an employee 100% of a company car benefit differ compared to how favor works?
For sure. So with a favor program, you can choose the business use percentage that you assume or expect your employees to be driving. So typically we look at something around a 71.4%, which is relevant because that's equivalent to 5 out of 7 days of the week for business use, which makes sense on a traditional work week. So that's where that can be really tailored to the individual and the circumstance and the driving they're doing for work.
Absolutely, to make sure that you're paying effectively and adequately for business use. Now, if you come from an organization that wants to have a little bit of a richer benefit, or that your organization drivers, for example, are doing a lot of overtime, you can actually go up to 75% on your business use as per the IRS regulations. So I think it really comes back to taking control over your costs and being really smarter at estimating, but also leveraging your customer success team, your car data partner, for example, or your reimbursement partner to understand what is going to work best for you, right? Like 100%. What is going to work best for your goals as an organization, but also for your drivers.
100%. I think also another benefit of this kind of program is there can be a lot more business insights gained from it. You can have a more thorough understanding of the kind of driving your drivers are doing, and you can build a program that's going to be specialized and tailored to them, including different situations for different drivers. So you can build out different driver profiles to really address the different kind of personas that you have within your driving population.
Yeah, such a good point, right? Like there's not a one size fits all here. Particularly when we're building a flexible reimbursement program, we need to be able to make decisions that best suit drivers, right?
100%.
You've probably seen scenarios too where you might be transitioning a group of salespeople, for example, where there's senior sales managers and there's junior ones and there's merchandisers, and they're asking themselves, like, how do I make this a flexible tiered benefit, right? Where I can say, okay, like my senior managers are going to get a little bit more. They're going to be reimbursed off a more, luxurious vehicle, for example. So I think that's so key in mentioning that there's this flexibility there in determining what your costs are going to be versus taking it at face value and paying 100% of all your company car costs.
And I think along with that, there's a big change management piece in introducing a vehicle program, because it obviously is different than fleet, and doing so in a way that is respectful of drivers so they don't feel as though something's being taken away. They understand that they're actually moving on to a more equitable form of compensation/reimbursement.
Love that. Such a good point. Such a good point. So we talked about really streamlining costs by reducing the maintenance fees, the accidents fees, all of these elements that are not directly related to the job. Now let's talk about some of the hidden burden associated with liability and risk. So what would you say is a really common, anecdote or approach or story that we're seeing from customers with regards to the risk in their program?
So definitely fleets come with a significant amount of risk. At times, people are driving branded vehicles, for example. So any sort of accident, that's done in a branded company car. Even when it's not branded, there's definitely opportunities for things like personal driving outside of work hours. And obviously that's something that you're having to deal with as an employer, even though it's not on your employees' quote unquote clock, affecting things like insurance and making an already expensive program even more expensive.
Totally. Insurance premiums can be significantly impacted by this, but even if that aside, like if there's an accident where a vehicle is totaled, you got to replace that car, right? Like you don't have a program in place to support the flexibility of transition. And so that's a pain. Plus, not to mention the fact that often company cars are provided 100% of the time, right? So you take it home for the weekend, you might drive your kid to soccer after school, which is totally fair, that's great, but what happens if that vehicle is used by somebody who's not you and they get in an accident? What does that do to the company, right? And I've seen it time and time again. I've actually been participating in a couple transitions where that was the reason behind them having to make the switch, or at least make a favor program available to drivers because they couldn't handle the risk anymore. And that aside too, of course there's liability associated with not understanding your costs and your exposure to challenges like this. So it's a really, really important topic. Okay, so another element to consider here, of course, is the time it takes to manage a program like this. Now, we talked a little bit about using a fleet management company before. We kind of brushed by it, but of course, there's a lot of internal costs associated with managing the programs like this on a day over day. We have things like maintenance schedules, we have registration and licensing, we have turnover, reconditioning, tax and allowance, sourcing vehicles. What is a day in the life of somebody who manages fleet, a fleet manager, for example? What does that look like?
So there's a lot of time that definitely could be more effectively reallocated for people managing fleet. There are the unforeseen circumstances, such as accidents, having to work through that. Although you do have like a fleet partner you may be working with, a lot of this is going to be internal administrative burden. So that's definitely something that should be largely taken into account in terms of efficiency, and also just finding ways to streamline processes so both administration and employees are seeing the most effective use of their time throughout their day, and as well as onboarding and offboarding of employees. That's another big one. There's already a lot of steps being taken in the administrative side of onboarding an employee without taking into account acquiring a vehicle, registering it, and all those steps.
Absolutely. So true. I was speaking to a procurement team the other day, and their fleet management team kind of sat under procurement, and they were spending almost their entire week of that week we were chatting, trying to procure cars, like just trying to procure cars. That was the basic issue. They couldn't source them. They were calling everywhere. They were trying to figure out how to get their people on the road faster, and they just said, we've had enough. And that was just that week, right?
100%.
And like a couple months before, they had an accident, and then they had a maintenance schedule that wasn't correct, so they had people who weren't on the road. And at the end of the day, I think it's important to remember that the purpose of driving for work is so that your employees can get the job done, right? Like, whether it's being if you're a service provider, or if you're a salesperson, if you're an engineer, like whatever your job is, you have to get from point A to point B. That's the point. So our job should be to enable that without increasing the burden on employees, regardless of your position, to allow that to happen. I also think there's a big conception of fleet managers feeling like they have to be an expert all the time. Like you need to understand your fleet program through and through. And we've mentioned there's a lot of costs that aren't understood, but there's also a fear in, you know, making the transition of, will I continue to understand my program? And I think there's a good case to be made about working with a partner who can help you understand your program better and also remove the ambiguity and allow you to put time back in your day to do more strategic initiatives for your company instead of just trying to find some cars, right?
Of course. I think the change management piece is really key, both on the driver employee side as well as the administrative side. So you really understand the program that's being run, the reasoning behind it, and the costs associated with, and you can really break it down in a lot more detail than you ever could with any sort of fleet program.
Totally. Now, to kind of summarize this conversation, we've talked about cost, we've talked about liability, we've talked about burden. Can we summarize the true value in switching from a car program to a reimbursement approach?
So I think obviously there's different pieces of value that are going to have different measures for different companies in terms of where their priorities are lying. But the main things we're hearing, speaking to different prospects on the market, would be things like reduction of liability, so that you're not facing those known and unknown liabilities. Administrative burden, so having a program that your administrators understand and isn't taking all of their time to manage or run. So I think those would be the main pieces, as well as cost reduction. So looking for approach that's equitable, your employees are being properly reimbursed for their work driving, but you're not paying for 100% of their driving that's being done for or not for work purposes.
Absolutely. And you know, to summarize as well, we're seeing typically a 30% reduction in spend year over year net when these transitions are happening. But it doesn't necessarily have to be like that. As Griffin, you mentioned, like, you know, the way you build your program has to be based on the goals you want to accomplish. So that means if you want a richer program, you want your drivers to feel whole, you want them to take home a bigger benefit, let's build it that way. But if you're looking to really streamline your costs, typically, direct comparison, there's around a 30% reduction, simply for removing that liability, removing that personal use, removing those chargebacks, and making sure that costs are efficient. And that's really the value of working with a true partner. So Griffin, you know, when making this transition, when working with CarData, for example, what are the benefits of having a program partner to help you transition between fleet and vehicle reimbursement?
100%. So obviously bringing on a partner who does this day in and day out is a large asset for both you as an individual as well as your company. I think a big piece of that is the change management, them walking you through the different steps, how to message it effectively to your employees driving for work, how to message it to your administration so people understand what's happening and the reasoning behind it, as well as a long-term partnership. So we're looking to build relationships that span the whole period of time we're working together and beyond. We're not, you know, looking to just implement a program and then kind of walk away. It's something that's going to be monitored, it's going to be discussed, and also largely outsourced from an administration perspective, so your administrators understand what's going on and why, but they're not carrying the burden of employing the whole program.
Absolutely. A partner who is able to consult effectively in helping you achieve your goals, but also take that burden off of you and allow you to have a deep breath and take a little bit of a break from the stress often associated with the scary thing in the room, which is the company car, right? So I think co-creation is a really important element here, where you should be able to lean on your partner to say, okay, I want to achieve this, how do I do it? And work with a partner who understands the vehicle reimbursement industry, who understands the programs, whether it's fixed and variable rates, so favor, whether it's tax-free car allowance, whether it's a cents per mile program, that you can work to build, whether it's a tiered or a hybrid approach that is going to best suit you. So that co-creation is going to be so key here, and not only being able to leverage the education associated with your partner, so their rollout tools, for example, like their internal vehicle policy, the internal messaging documents, but the custom creation, the custom training, and the technology, right? Because at the end of the day, your partner should be able to provide easy to use technology that is able to accomplish that goal. And being able to work together to leverage not only the expertise, but also the technology is how we find those savings, how we find that 30% while also keeping drivers happy in the way that our partners want to do it. Well, today was a big conversation. We talked about the costs associated with traditional vehicle management. We talked about high cost of acquisition of cars. We talked about maintenance. We talked about liability, and we talked about burden. Griffin, thank you so much for bringing your unique pre-sales, pre-launch perspective and really sharing some of the key struggles that are really common in today's modern market. We appreciate you being here.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Well, this has been The Key. Thanks so much, and drive safe.